Margaret Maggie Reynolds had lived in the same neighborhood for over 30 years. She was a kind, quiet woman in her late 60s, with silver hair that she always tied in a neat bun. Every evening, just before sunset, she took a walk around the block with her beloved German shepherd, Duke. It was a routine she never missed, no matter the weather. The fresh air helped clear her mind, and having Duke by her side always made her feel safe. Duke was not just an ordinary dog. He had once served in the U.S. Army, trained for search and rescue missions, and to protect those in danger. Though he was now retired, his sharp instincts had never faded. He was large, strong, and incredibly intelligent. Maggie had adopted him through a veteran program, giving him a peaceful home after years of service. Despite his past, he was gentle with her, always careful, always protective. That evening, as Maggie stepped out with Duke, the sky was painted with beautiful shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the trees. Maggie greeted a few neighbors on the way, exchanging smiles and small talk. Duke walked beside her, his ears alert, his eyes scanning everything around them. He had always been watchful, never ignoring even the smallest movement. As they walked further, the streets became quieter. Most people were inside, finishing their dinner or watching television. Maggie enjoyed these peaceful moments, the sound of her footsteps mixing with Duke's steady breathing. She didn't know that someone else was watching them. Two men stood near a parked car, pretending to have a conversation. Their eyes followed Maggie and Duke as they walked past. One of them, a tall man with a dark jacket, nudged his friend. "Easy target," he whispered. The other man, wearing a baseball cap, glanced around to make sure no one else was nearby. They had been looking for an opportunity, and to them, an elderly woman walking alone seemed like the perfect chance. Maggie had no idea she was being followed. She continued walking, humming softly to herself. Duke, however, sensed something. His ears perked up, and his tail stiffened slightly. He slowed his pace, glancing behind them. His sharp mind had detected something unusual. He could hear footsteps that weren't there before. Maggie noticed Duke's change in behavior. "What is it, boy?" she asked, patting his head. Duke didn't respond the way he usually did. Instead of wagging his tail or looking up at her, he kept his eyes on the street behind them. Maggie trusted Duke completely. If he was acting this way, something wasn't right. She quickened her pace slightly, hoping to reach the next street where there were more houses. Duke stayed close, his muscles tense. The men behind them noticed the change and knew they had to act fast. Unaware of what was about to happen, Maggie turned the corner. In the next few moments, her peaceful walk would take a terrifying turn. But she wasn't alone. Duke was ready. As Maggie turned the corner, the street ahead was quieter than she had expected. Most of the houses had their lights on, but the sidewalks were empty. A single street lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. Duke stayed close to her side, his body tense. His ears twitched as he listened carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the area behind them. Maggie didn't want to ignore Duke's unusual behavior. Over the months she had spent with him, she had learned to trust his instincts. If Duke sensed something was wrong, then it probably was. Her grip on his leash tightened as she glanced over her shoulder. That's when she saw them. Two men were walking behind her, not too close, but not far enough to be casual. They weren't talking, just moving steadily in her direction. A strange feeling settled in Maggie's chest. She wasn't a fearful person, but something about the way they walked made her uneasy. Trying to stay calm, she picked up her pace. Duke matched her steps, his movements controlled but alert. He didn't bark or growl, but Maggie could feel his energy shift. He was in protection mode. The men noticed her speeding up and exchanged glances. They had been looking for an easy target, and from a distance, an elderly woman walking alone seemed like one. But they had underestimated Duke. One of the men, the taller one in a dark jacket, nodded toward Maggie. "Let's do it now," he muttered. His friend, wearing a baseball cap, hesitated for a second, but then agreed. Before Maggie could react, the taller man rushed forward and grabbed the strap of her purse. The sudden force nearly pulled her off balance. Maggie gasped, her heart racing as she stumbled slightly. "Let go," she shouted, gripping her purse tightly. The second man moved quickly, shoving her shoulder just enough to try and make her lose her grip. But before he could do anything more, something unexpected happened. Duke sprang into action. With lightning speed, the large German shepherd lunged forward, placing himself between Maggie and the attackers. A deep, fierce growl rumbled from his throat, unlike anything Maggie had ever heard before. His sharp teeth glistened under the dim street lamp as he barked, a loud, commanding sound that sent a chill through the air. The man holding Maggie's purse froze. His friend took a step back, eyes widening as he got his first real look at Duke. This was no ordinary pet. The dog's stance, the way he moved, the control in his every motion. It was clear he was trained, and trained well. Duke's eyes locked onto the man closest to Maggie, his body low and ready to strike. He was waiting for a reason. Just one wrong move, and he would act. The men had expected an easy job. They hadn't expected this. For the first time, fear flickered in their eyes. Duke wasn't just protecting Maggie, he was warning them. And if they didn't back off, they were about to learn just how dangerous a trained protector could be. The street was silent except for Duke's deep warning growl. His body was tense, his powerful muscles ready to strike. Maggie had never seen him like this before, but she felt no fear, not of him. She knew Duke was protecting her, just as he had been trained to do. The man in the dark jacket still held onto Maggie's purse, but his grip had loosened. His eyes darted between Duke and his friend. He had assumed this would be easy, but now he wasn't so sure. The second man, the one in the baseball cap, took a step back, clearly nervous. "Man, this dog ain't normal," he muttered under his breath. Maggie stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. Then, gathering her courage, she yanked her purse back with all her strength. The man holding it was so distracted by Duke that he let go without thinking. Maggie stumbled backward, but she quickly regained her footing, keeping a firm hold on Duke's leash. The taller man scowled. "It's just a dog," he said, trying to sound tough. "We can handle it." But before he could make another move, Duke let out a powerful bark that echoed through the empty street. It wasn't just noise. It was a clear warning. His sharp eyes locked onto the man's movements, studying him, waiting. Duke was trained to assess threats, and he knew exactly what to do. The man in the baseball cap took another step back. "This ain't worth it," he whispered urgently to his friend. But the taller man wasn't ready to give up. He took a step forward, trying to intimidate Maggie. That was a mistake. Duke didn't wait. In a swift, controlled movement, he lunged forward, his powerful body moving with precision. He didn't attack recklessly. He didn't need to. Instead, he stopped just inches from the man's leg and barked again, louder this time. His teeth were visible, his posture dominant. The man jumped back in fear, nearly losing his balance. "Whoa! Whoa!" he shouted, holding up his hands. He had been in fights before, but this wasn't a fight he could win. Maggie, now regaining her confidence, took a firm step forward. "You need to leave," she said, her voice steady. "Now." For a moment, the taller man hesitated, but the way Duke stood, completely in control, completely unafraid, made him realize the truth. They had picked the wrong target. The second man didn't wait for his friend to decide. He turned and ran, disappearing down the street. Seeing this, the taller man cursed under his breath and quickly followed. Within seconds, they were gone. Maggie let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. She looked down at Duke, who was still standing strong, watching the street to make sure the danger was truly gone. Then, as if sensing that his job was done, he turned to Maggie and wagged his tail slightly, his fierce expression softening. She knelt down and stroked his fur. "You saved me, boy," she whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you." Duke leaned into her touch, his eyes full of loyalty. He had done his duty, just like he always had. But Maggie knew this wasn't over yet. Someone needed to call the police. Maggie stood there for a few seconds, still in shock but grateful beyond words. She hugged Duke tightly, feeling his warmth against her chest. The street was now eerily quiet again, with only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind breaking the silence. She kept her hand on Duke's back, stroking him gently as her heart slowly calmed down. Duke, however, was still alert. His ears were up, and his eyes scanned the area, watching every shadow, every movement. Even though the attackers had run off, Duke knew better than anyone that danger could appear in the blink of an eye. He was no longer growling, but his posture remained strong, ready for anything. Maggie had always admired how dependable he was. He had been her companion through thick and thin, and tonight, he had proved just how valuable that bond was. Maggie took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She knew the next step was important. She had to make sure the attackers didn't get away with this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. With shaky fingers, she dialed 911. The operator answered almost immediately. 911. "What's your emergency?" Maggie spoke calmly, though her voice was still a bit shaky. "I was attacked. 2 men tried to rob me, but my dog, he's a retired military canine, scared them off. They ran, but I'm not sure if they're gone for good." The operator's voice immediately shifted to a more urgent tone. "Ma'am, I need you to stay where you are. Are you and your dog okay?" Maggie looked down at Duke, who was now sitting beside her, his head slightly tilted as if he were trying to understand what was going on. He was panting softly, but he seemed fine. "We're both okay," she replied. "I'm not hurt, but I don't know if those men are gone for good. Help is on the way. Stay calm, ma'am. Keep your dog with you, and don't approach anyone you don't recognize." Maggie nodded, even though she knew the operator couldn't see her. She felt a little comforted knowing the police were on their way. She didn't want to be outside any longer than she had to, but she wasn't about to leave the scene until they arrived. She looked around once more, just to make sure the men weren't coming back. The street seemed peaceful now, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something could happen at any moment. She took another deep breath, steadying herself. Minutes passed before the flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of the street. The police car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall man, while the other was a woman with short brown hair. They quickly approached, their expressions serious but not unkind. "Are you Margaret Reynolds?" the woman officer asked. Maggie nodded. "Yes. Thank you for coming." The woman officer smiled gently. "No problem. Can you tell us what happened?" Maggie briefly explained everything, including how the men had tried to rob her, how Duke had protected her, and how the attackers had run off after Duke had scared them away. She mentioned that they hadn't gotten a good look at the men's faces, but they had heard their voices. The officers took notes, nodding along. They also asked about Duke's background, and Maggie explained how he had been a retired military canine. "That explains a lot," the man officer said, impressed. "Sounds like your dog saved you tonight." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "He's a good boy," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "He's always had my back." The officers looked at Duke, who was now sitting calmly by Maggie's side, his alert gaze following every movement. "Well, it's clear he's a hero," the woman officer said with a smile. "We'll start gathering information and see if we can track down those 2. You're safe now, but we'll do our best to make sure they don't try anything else." Maggie nodded, feeling a bit of relief. She knew it would take some time, but she trusted that the police would handle things. For now, she was just thankful to be alive, and even more thankful for Duke's bravery. The officers took a few more details before heading back to their car, promising to keep in touch. As they drove off, Maggie looked down at Duke, who was now lying on the grass, his tail gently wagging. She bent down and gave him a soft pat. "You really are my hero, Duke." Duke looked up at her, his eyes filled with loyalty, as if he knew exactly how much he meant to her. For Maggie, it was a bond that went beyond words. And tonight, Duke had reminded her just how special that bond truly was. Maggie finally felt a little safer after the police left, but the night's events still played in her mind. She held onto Duke's leash tightly as they started walking back home. Her legs were still a bit shaky, but she knew she had to stay strong. Duke, as always, walked beside her, his head held high, ears still alert. Even though the danger had passed, he remained watchful, making sure nothing would harm Maggie again. As they approached her house, the porch light glowed warmly, welcoming them back. Maggie let out a breath of relief. Home had never felt so comforting. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, allowing Duke to enter first. He sniffed around for a moment, checking every corner of the living room before finally relaxing. Only then did Maggie feel like she could breathe properly again. She set her purse down on the table and walked to the kitchen. Her hands were still slightly unsteady, so she poured herself a glass of water, taking slow sips. The cold liquid soothed her dry throat. She looked down at Duke, who sat patiently beside her, his eyes never leaving her. He could sense she was still shaken. "You must be hungry, boy," she said with a small smile. She reached into the cupboard and pulled out his favorite treats. Duke wagged his tail, his posture finally relaxing a bit. She placed a few treats in his bowl, watching as he ate them happily. Maggie walked over to the couch and sat down, rubbing her temples. The adrenaline was wearing off, and now exhaustion was settling in. She thought about what could have happened if Duke hadn't been there. The idea made her shudder. She had always known he was special, but tonight, he had proven just how much of a protector he truly was. She reached for her phone, realizing she should let someone know what had happened. Her closest friend, Linda, would want to hear about this. She dialed the number, and after a few rings, Linda picked up. "Maggie, is everything okay?" Linda's voice was filled with concern. Maggie hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm okay now, but something happened tonight." She then told Linda everything: the attack, how Duke had defended her, and how the police had gotten involved. "Oh my goodness!" Linda exclaimed. "Are you sure you're all right? Do you want me to come over?" Maggie smiled at her friend's concern. "I'm fine, really. Duke took care of everything. I just wanted to let you know." Linda sighed. "That dog of yours is a real hero. But Maggie, this is serious. What if those men come back?" Maggie glanced at Duke, who was now lying down at her feet, still keeping an eye on her. "I don't think they will. They were terrified of Duke, but I'll be careful. I promise." After talking a little longer, Maggie ended the call, feeling a bit more at ease. She looked down at Duke again and reached out to stroke his fur. "You're my guardian angel," she whispered. Duke thumped his tail against the floor, as if he understood every word. Maggie knew she had been lucky tonight, but more than luck, she had Duke, and as long as he was by her side, she knew she was never truly alone. The next morning, Maggie woke up feeling a little tired but grateful to see the sunlight streaming through her window. The events of the previous night still played in her mind, but she reminded herself that she was safe, thanks to Duke. She looked down to see him lying at the foot of her bed, his ears twitching slightly as he slept. Even in rest, he was always alert. She carefully got out of bed, not wanting to wake him, and went to the kitchen to make some coffee. As the rich aroma filled the air, she felt a little more at ease. She poured herself a cup and stepped onto the porch, letting the morning breeze calm her nerves. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a few early risers walking their dogs or jogging past. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, danger had been so close. Duke soon joined her, stretching before sitting down beside her. Maggie reached down and stroked his fur. "You really are something special, aren't you?" she murmured. Duke looked up at her with his warm, intelligent eyes, his tail wagging slightly. A short while later, Maggie heard a car pull up in front of her house. She looked up to see a police vehicle, and her heart skipped a beat. Had something happened? Was there news about the two men? An officer stepped out. It was the same kind-looking woman from the night before. Maggie stood up as she approached. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer greeted. "Good morning," Maggie replied. "Is everything all right?" The officer nodded. "Yes, I just wanted to check in on you and also give you an update." Maggie felt a mix of curiosity and nervousness. Did they find the men? The officer sighed. "Not yet, but we're working on it. We've increased patrols around the area, and we're checking security cameras nearby to get a better look at them." Maggie felt some relief knowing that the police were taking things seriously. "Thank you. That means a lot." The officer smiled and then looked down at Duke. "And I have to say, your dog is incredible. I read more about military-trained canines after last night, and they truly are heroes." Maggie chuckled, reaching down to scratch Duke's ears. "He sure is. He saved my life." The officer nodded. "Well, if you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to call us. And in the meantime, be extra careful when you go out." "I will," Maggie promised. After the officer left, Maggie sat back down on her porch, thinking about what had been said. She knew she had to stay cautious, but she refused to live in fear. Looking down at Duke, she smiled. "I think we make a pretty good team, don't we?" Duke responded by gently nudging her hand with his nose. Maggie laughed softly, feeling a little more at peace. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. That evening, Maggie decided to take Duke for a short walk around the neighborhood. She knew the police were keeping an eye on things, but she still felt a little uneasy. However, she also didn't want fear to control her life. Duke had protected her once, and she trusted that he would do so again if needed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, and the streets were quiet. A few neighbors were outside, watering their gardens or chatting on their porches. Seeing familiar faces gave Maggie some comfort. As they walked past a small park, Duke suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, and he sniffed the air. Maggie followed his gaze and saw two figures standing near a bench under a tree. Her heart skipped a beat. From this distance, she couldn't be sure, but something about them felt familiar. Duke let out a low, quiet growl. It was the same sound he had made the night before when the men had approached. Maggie tightened her grip on the leash. "Easy, boy," she whispered. One of the figures shifted slightly, and Maggie caught a glimpse of his face under the dimming light. Her breath caught in her throat. It was them, the same two men who had tried to rob her. They hadn't seen her yet, but they were talking quietly, looking around as if they were waiting for something or someone. A wave of fear and anger rushed through Maggie. How could they still be walking around freely after what they had done? Duke remained perfectly still, his body tense but controlled. He was waiting for Maggie's cue. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had options. She wasn't powerless. Slowly, she stepped back, keeping her eyes on the men. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but she needed to act fast. Without making a sound, she pulled out her phone and quickly dialed the police. "This is Maggie Brooks," she whispered when the dispatcher answered. "I see the men who tried to attack me last night. They're near the park on Oak Street." "Stay calm, Mom," the dispatcher replied. "We're sending officers your way now. Do not approach them." Maggie had no intention of getting any closer. She slowly backed away, keeping a firm hold on Duke. He remained silent but alert, his sharp eyes locked on the two men. Minutes felt like hours as she waited. Just when she thought the men might leave, the sound of sirens filled the air. The flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared at the end of the street. The two men immediately reacted. One of them turned to run, but before he could take more than a few steps, an officer jumped out of the car and shouted, "Stop right there." Maggie watched as the police moved in quickly, blocking their escape. Duke let out a single low bark as if he, too, understood that justice was finally being served. One of the men hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between the officers and the street, as if trying to decide whether to run. But before he could make a move, the officer closest to him stepped forward. "Hands where we can see them," the officer commanded. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. The man in the dark jacket slowly raised his hands. His friend, the one in the baseball cap, was not as smart. He turned and tried to run, but Duke, sensing the movement, let out a loud, deep bark. The sudden noise startled the man, causing him to stumble. That was all the time the officers needed. Within seconds, one of the officers caught up to him, grabbing his arm before he could escape. The man struggled for a brief moment, but the officer quickly gained control, placing handcuffs on him. "You're not going anywhere," the officer said firmly. Maggie watched, her heart racing, but filled with relief. Finally, these men were being taken into custody. She took a deep breath, her grip on Duke's leash loosening slightly now that the danger was over. Duke, still standing tall beside her, wagged his tail just a little, as if sensing that his job was done. One of the officers walked over to Maggie. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Maggie nodded. "Yes, thanks to Duke. If he hadn't noticed them, I might not have even realized they were here." The officer smiled, glancing down at Duke. "He's got great instincts. A true protector." Maggie looked at Duke with pride. "He really is." The officers took statements from Maggie and a few other witnesses who had gathered nearby. A couple of neighbors who had been in the park also came forward, confirming that the two men had been acting suspiciously before the police arrived. After a while, the officers assured Maggie that the men would be facing serious charges. "We have enough evidence from last night and tonight," one of them explained. "They won't be bothering anyone anymore." Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That's a relief. As the police cars pulled away, taking the men with them, Maggie turned to Duke. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him. "You did it again, boy," she whispered. "You kept me safe." Duke licked her face, his tail wagging happily. As they walked back home, Maggie felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt since the attack. She knew the world wasn't always safe, but with Duke by her side, she felt stronger. She had once saved him by giving him a home after his service ended, but in return, he had saved her in more ways than she could count. Looking down at Duke, she smiled. "Let's go home, hero." And with that, they walked into the night, knowing that no matter what came next, they would always face it together.